Okay, let's get started on our very last chapter, chapter 31. We can do this. Almost over. Okay, starting with number one. Throughout his presidency, Bill Clinton strove to align U.S. foreign policy with that of the United Nations. This is a problem among a lot of Americans because we don't always agree with the policy of the United Nations, who tend to skew towards socialism when we are more capitalist. But they have no problem with our capitalism as long as we're giving them money. Go figure. The White House also made no effort to hide its sympathy with socialist and communist regimes, which we actually already saw. In November 2000, Clinton flew to Vietnam. He met with communist leaders in Hanoi. Because he lifted trade sanctions, many American corporations had invested there, enabling communists to maintain very oppressive control over their people. When businesses go to communist nations, the communists are the only ones, the communist leaders are the only ones who really benefit from that. By 2000, stock prices soared higher than ever before, but many stocks were trading at prices way above their value. Eventually, the economy began to stall under the burden of rising federal interest rates, a decrease in consumer spending brought on by high taxes. When people don't have money to spend, then they don't spend it. The collapse of many internet-based companies who were shorting their stock. They were actually saying their stock was worth a lot more than what it was. Okay. President Clinton often spoke of his desire to leave a legacy. He wanted to leave a legacy, something great so people could remember him. Instead, his legacy was a string of scandals. The 2000 election neared, and Democrats began to distance themselves from the president and his vice president, Al Gore, which is going to be unfortunate for Al Gore because he's actually going to be running for president. Go figure. First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton decided that she was going to run for office as well as the U.S. Senator. Now, she had to decide where she was going to run from. Everybody assumed when she said she was going to run for the Senate that it would be from Arkansas because that's where she had lived for so long with her husband as he was governor of Arkansas and she was first lady of Arkansas. And she's like, no, I don't want to be in Arkansas. I mean, it's a little podunk place. And then she traveled around the United States giving speeches and trying to decide where she wanted to live to run for Senate. And she decided that the most powerful place she could live and run for Senate would be New York. So she purchased a home in New York and ran for Senate. That's how she chose New York. She did not live in New York prior to her campaign. She had no legislative experience whatsoever. She had an experience in law, but she became the first lady ever to be elected to the U.S. Senate. The Democratic Party and the liberal media all promoted Al Gore. The Republican Party and most conservatives were rallying around George W. Bush. He was a son of the 41st President, George H.W. Bush. Bush unashamedly identified himself as a born-again Christian. He testified publicly in his faith in Christ. There's a quotation here from the Maranatha Christian Journal. My faith is an integral part of my whole being. That's what faith is. I don't think you can separate your faith from who you are. That's absolutely correct. And it doesn't matter what your faith is. You cannot separate it from who you are. So if you're a scientist who has his faith in science, you're not going to be able to separate that from what you believe. Okay. And science, if it's not using the scientific method, yeah, it's a religion. Okay. He says, if you're a Christian, a Jew, a Muslim, you're equally an American. The reason he came out and said this was because he was now being accused. He said, I believe in Jesus Christ. And immediately the press said, oh my goodness, he's going to force everybody to become a Christian. He is going to start, religion in politics. And it's like, oh, stop it. So he said, if you're a Christian, Jew, or Muslim, you're equally an American. That's the great thing about America. It's the right to worship the way you see fit. There was controversy over the election results. This is usually when I let you watch this really boring, just awful documentary from CNN. It's terrible. I'm so glad we're not in school. About this time in American politics when we didn't have the exact count. It was all so exciting. It's really not. But anyway, there was controversy over the election results because in Florida, there was a couple of counties that had a new type of ballot called a butterfly ballot. And when they opened up and you were supposed to hit the dot next to the name, the dots and the names didn't necessarily line up. And so people realized they were voting for the person they didn't mean to vote for. And so they had to do a recount in those counties where they had physical human beings standing there and counting dots. Not kidding. So after the election results were finally tabulated, the Bush was declared the victor. Democrats disputed the vote. They demanded a recount in certain Florida counties. Those recounts were done, and the liberal media still accused Bush of stealing the election. Later recounts would prove that George W. Bush had won the election fairly, even in the disputed counties in Florida. Okay, so this is the way some of the media likes to mess with politicians they don't like, okay? Here is Bush. Here is Bush. Here is Bush. You see his eye? Okay. He's smiling. Okay, there's his profile, no problem. And then when he wins the election, they don't want him to win. They have him doing duck lips. This is one of the things they do. They try to pick the most unflattering picture and put it on. Not kidding. So Bush became the 43rd president of the United States and the second man in American history to have a father who had previously been president. Anybody know the first one? It was the Adamses. Adams, and then John Quincy Adams. John Adams, John Quincy Adams. One of Bush's first acts as president was to stop the flow of U.S. funding to international family planning groups that offered abortion services and counseling. Why would he cut off Planned Parenthood? Because Planned Parenthood, even though it says that it is a women's health service center, is actually a huge funnel for Democratic donations in politics. I know it's kind of a rough thing for a history teacher to say, but there it is. Okay, so Planned Parenthood has this math equation that they like to do, saying that only 3% of the services that they provide is abortion. You can see it here. This is their little standard here. Yeah, they are manipulating the numbers here for this. So what they do, if somebody goes in for an abortion, they have to take a pregnancy test. That is considered a service. It's about $10, but it's a service. They are given, they're tested for STDs. I'm skipping the one in the second one. They have to do a urine test to check for STDs. That is one service. Then they're given birth control. That's a service. And then the abortion is performed. That's a service. So they're equating the $1,000 abortion service with the $10 service for pregnancy testing, STD testing, and the birth control testing, or birth control provision. So that's how they're doing their math. Everything that they do when a person goes in for abortion is considered a service. If you want to see a really great explanation of this and how they were able to tear this whole thing apart, go on Live Action. You can see the little Live Action logo in the top corner here. Live Action, type it into your YouTube and type in Planned Parenthood 3%. Okay, and service. Anything like that, it'll come up. You can do the search and it's a really, really clear example of how Planned Parenthood has manipulated this information. So when we talk about Planned Parenthood and how the political machine works, this is why I don't like Planned Parenthood because of their abortion services, first of all. I don't like the fact that they lie about a lot of the services that they offer. They will come out and say women won't be able to get mammograms if we don't have a Planned Parenthood in their area. And yet like 1% of Planned Parenthood actually have mammograms available. That's to check for breast cancer. They talk about all the stuff that they offer for women, but they don't offer any prenatal care whatsoever. Unless you are there to abort your baby or to get birth control, they have nothing for you. So I don't like the way they lie about how they present themselves. But this is the thing that really, really makes me angry. And I cannot understand why they have not been basically disbanded for their absolute dishonesty. So this is what happens with Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood receives over $500 million of taxpayer money from the federal government every single year. Planned Parenthood reports $127 million in profit. They would have lost, that means they would have lost over $400 million last year and shut its doors without tax funding. That's what they're telling people. If we don't get the tax funding, then we're going to have to close our doors. Since 2008, however, Planned Parenthood and its affiliates have increased federal election campaign contributions by over $19 million. They say they're going to go broke and have to close the doors if they don't have federal funding, and yet they're taking that money from the federal government, from tax money, and they're using it to pay out campaign contributions. How is that legal? They paid out over $3 million in 2008 and 2010, $22 million in 2012 and 2014. 99% of their campaign donations go to the Democratic Party. How is that legal? That's what I want to see get exploded. I mean, not literally exploded. I want to see that taken to court, and I want to see that just stopped, because that really bugs me. Okay, now to promote the economic recovery, President Bush signed legislation implementing the first substantial tax cut since the Reagan years. Now, we are already in a cusp of recovery from previous years. Clinton helped to bring up some of that recovery. I'm going to give him credit where credit is due. But to promote further economic recovery, President Bush is saying, okay, we got to cut the taxes first time since the Reagan years. Why? Because when people have more money, they spend their money, and that comes back to the government in the form of taxes, like sales taxes. Then on September 11th, 2001, terrorists from outside of our country carried out the deadliest attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor striking. They struck New York. They flew a plane into the World Trade Center. And then 15 minutes later, a second plane flew into the second World Trade Center. At 8:45, a hijacked 757 airliner suddenly slammed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center, exploding on impact. People saw the smoke coming out, and they knew a plane had hit it, but they thought it was an accident. They said, oh my goodness, how in the world could this even happen? I mean, we have all these, what was going on? Maybe there was something wrong with the plane. And then as they were watching it, a second plane exploded into the other tower just 15 minutes later. Then at 10:30 a.m., both of the Twin Towers collapsed. 2,800 people were dead. Some people escaped. 2,800 people died. The way the Twin Towers were engineered when they were built, they were to collapse in on themselves so they wouldn't topple over onto other skyscrapers. So the police and the fire knew they had to escort as many people out as possible, but people were on such high floors that they really didn't have an out. There was no way to get out. They couldn't take the elevator. There's no time to get on the stairs. The stairs there was plane fuel that was burning. They couldn't get past the fiery part, where the planes had actually crashed through. Some people got so desperate they actually threw themselves out of the window because they'd rather die from the impact of the fall than to be burned alive. Horrific stuff. But yeah, this was just a horrible moment in American history. A third airliner struck the Pentagon building in Washington, D.C. Approximately 190 people died in that attack on the Pentagon. The Pentagon is the world's largest office building. Several stories high, multiple buildings like in one contiguous loop around there. A fourth plane was probably bound for the White House or Capitol Hill, but it was taken down in a field in Pennsylvania. 45 people died in that crash. And that was taken down by the people on the plane, not the hijackers, but the people who refused to allow that plane to hurt more American citizens than just them. It's just an awful day in American history. Absolutely horrible. Mayor Rudy Giuliani urged New Yorkers to stay home because the city was under attack. You can see Hillary Clinton there because she was senator of New York at the time. And then it became known that the hijackings were the work of the radical Islamic terrorist network Al-Qaeda and its leader Osama bin Laden. We talked about him in the last chapter. Okay, so when this all first went down, the press immediately started saying we have to look for somebody who has a lot of money to have coordinated these attacks. And I remember, by this time I had kids. they were going to Calvary Christian School. I dropped them off at school. I got into my car and I was driving to college because I was going back to school myself. And that's when I first heard about the 9/11 attacks. It was on the radio. And they first started talking about, it has to be somebody who has lots of money. And I remember in my car thinking, why did they need a lot of money to do this? They hijacked planes and flew them into American buildings. That doesn't require a lot of money. For some reason, our press was really pushing for this idea that it had to be some multi-billionaire. Well, it turned out it was a multi-billionaire. It was Osama bin Laden, but he didn't need the money to coordinate these attacks. The men who were found to have attacked our country this way were men who entered the United States on student visas or work visas or visiting visas. You can come for a variety of reasons to the United States. Many of them got state licenses, driver's licenses from Virginia, because Virginia didn't have a law stating that you had to be a citizen to get a Virginia state license. They used credit cards to purchase plane tickets. They used their state IDs, their driver's license, to get on planes, and they used box cutters as their weapon of choice to hijack these planes and fly them into buildings. It was a low-cost, low-tech hijacking and attack on the United States of America. But out of this is going to come a lot of high-tech, preemptive. We got to be very, very careful. President Bush's response, one of his responses to 9/11 was to create the Department of Homeland Defense, and he's going to try to cover every base he possibly can. We need to make sure that people have adequate ID. Well, the terrorists had adequate ID. Okay, well, we need to make sure that guns aren't allowed on planes. They didn't have guns. They had knives, okay? They had, box cutters. So it got to the point where it's like, we're not going to allow box cutters, knives, tweezers, sewing scissors, pocket knives. I mean, you name it, anything with a sharp edge, you can't allow it. They wouldn't even have silverware on the planes anymore. You had to use like a spoon and a fork, and that's it. All of this was like extreme because we felt insecure. That's really why it did it. And then they also created this TSA, this department within the Department of Homeland Security that would inspect people as they got on planes. People were asked to remove their shoes because one guy was discovered to have a bomb kind of inside of his shoe that he was planning to ignite while he was on a plane. So after that, everybody has to take their shoes off because of that one guy. They found out that people were planning to mix chemicals on planes. So you can't take more than 3 ounces of any kind of liquid in a bottle on a plane so that people can't make bombs in the air. A lot of this was based on real life stuff, but it got to the point where it was almost ridiculous how the TSA was treating people. So there were some problems on both ends. When people who were had little babies with them and being told that they have to pour out their formula for their babies. They can't take the formula on the plane, and or breast milk, have to get rid of the breast milk because it's liquid and it's over 3 ounces. That gets to be the part where it's ridiculous. People who cannot eat solid food and having to have liquid food and having that food poured out because they can't take it on the plane. A lot of that kind of stuff happened. And it's just really awful, but I mean, it was trying to make everything as safe as possible, but that also meant that a lot of people's rights are going to get trampled on at the same time. President Bush also called for a military campaign, not just against the terrorists themselves, Osama bin Laden and his men, but on the nations around them that supported them and gave them shelter and aid. Congress responded, the whole Congress, without fail. Every single person in Congress responded with support on the war of terror. They all said yes, every one of them. And then they turned around when they realized the war wasn't that popular and it was going on and on and on. They turned around and said, I didn't mean to vote that way. Yes, you did. You were as scared as everybody else. One of the first targets of the war against terrorism was the Taliban. The Taliban had sheltered Osama bin Laden in the past and continued to shelter al-Qaeda terrorists. This Taliban was the extremely radical form of Islamic worship. Next, the Bush administration turned to another nation known to have harbored and supported Islamic terrorists, Iraq. governed by the dictator Saddam Hussein, which Bush knew about because his daddy had fought against Saddam Hussein. And when he first heard about the planes flying into the buildings, Saddam Hussein had always threatened the United States that he was going to come after them. And so Bush's first response was it Saddam Hussein? And they said, no, it wasn't him. Now, he asked, like, are you sure? Are you sure? And they found out it was actually Osama bin Laden. But the reason he went after Saddam Hussein was not because, his dad didn't take care of this business when he had it. It was because Saddam Hussein was terrorizing his own people, and he had threatened the United States multiple times. There's actually going to be a lot of stuff going on there. We'll talk about it. Now, when Bush was first informed about the attack on the United States, he was not in Washington, D.C. He was in another state, and he was reading to a group of school children, and the press was there watching him reading. And somebody came up to him and said there was possibly an accident where a plane flew into the World Trade Center. And Bush kind of absorbed that news, and he nodded and he said, okay. And they continued reading to the kids, because when you're in front of a bunch of little kids, you don't throw the book down and say, oh no, America's under attack, and then, leave them screaming and wondering, am I going to die? So he sat there very calmly, and then 15 minutes later, the second plane hitting that second building, and they're like, no, we're under terrorist attack. And at that point, close the book. It says, really nice talking to you guys. I'll talk to you later. And he walked out very calmly. And that's when he started putting everything in motion. The press who was there, understanding the situation, still ragged on him in the press, saying he didn't try at all to try and, get things together when he first heard about. Stop it. He was trying to protect a bunch of little kids from, being scared. Can you just give the guy a little bit of credit for that? Come on. Now, Iraq had been under suspicion for a very long time because in the early 1990s, it was discovered that they had been stockpiling weapons of mass destruction. In the 1990s, that was discovered. That was a real thing. They actually found weapons of mass destruction, primarily weapons that were of nuclear ilk, but the big ones were poisonous gas. Hussein had used chemical weapons in his war with Iran and against the Kurds in northern Iraq, so his own people. They were just what he considered of a different race. He killed more than 25,000 people using those chemical weapons, and those were weapons of mass destruction. They were discovered there in Iraq prior to this time by the UN. Following the Persian Gulf War, the UN destroyed tons of chemical weapons, long-range missiles, and chemical warheads. The UN, the United Nations, after the Persian Gulf War, discovered a cache of weapons of mass destruction. Pay very close attention to what I'm saying. There was not just evidence, there were actual weapons there in Iraq that had been found and destroyed by the UN. By March of 2003, the White House was convinced that Hussein was still hiding weapons of mass destruction, and they launched Operation Iraqi Freedom. This was an invasion of Iraq to remove Hussein from power. Why did the White House believe that Hussein was still hiding weapons of mass destruction? Because Hussein kept telling everybody he was hiding weapons of mass destruction. The spy networks around the world were all reporting the exact same thing. Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. There were spy networks out of countries in Africa who said Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. Great Britain, their spy network said, according to our research, Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. France reported it. Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. The United States said, from all of our intelligence that we're getting, Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. They went to the UN and they said, you need to go back and you need to tear that country up again and find all of his weapons of mass destruction. The UN at that point was just like, nah. The United States had to go to the UN over a dozen times and ask them to please go and investigate the charges that he had weapons of mass destruction. And the UN kept saying, no, we don't really need to do that. Then when they did finally go in and do an inspection, they gave Iraq time. They gave them like time before they went in to do the inspection. So things could easily be moved from one location to another. And then the UN didn't go where they wanted. They went wherever Iraq said, okay, we're going to take you here. Look, there's no weapons of mass destruction. Okay, you're okay then. So the United States was going, what is going on in this world? We know this guy has a history of weapons of mass destruction. All of the intelligence that's coming out says he has weapons of mass destruction. Even the scientists who were escaping from Iraq at this time were saying, the man has weapons of mass destruction and I worked on them. That's what they were saying. They were all saying the exact same thing. So the United States said, okay, then we're going after this guy. We are going to invade Iraq. We're going to remove Hussein from power, and we're going to find those weapons of mass destruction, and we're going to destroy them ourselves, if that's what it takes. So in 2003, we had marched into Iraq. We had captured Saddam Hussein. Okay, he actually went underground, literally underground, dug a hole and hid in it. Okay, and then was later found. The people of Iraq he was actually taken out of office. His sons, who were terrorists to their own people and torturers, were killed, and the people rejoiced. The people of Iraq were happy that he was gone. They were happy that Saddam Hussein was gone. The United States was looking everywhere for weapons of mass destruction, and they couldn't find them. Quite suddenly, the entire world turned on the United States. Only the United States. That's it. The entire world turned and said, see, there were no weapons of mass destruction. You should have known better than to just go and invade somebody else's country. The United States is like, are you kidding me? Your intelligence said the exact same thing ours did. What is going on here? And the press? Oh, they loved it. There's no weapons of mass destruction. The government was just using this as an excuse to take out somebody else and try to set up a colony. We weren't trying to set up a colony, people. We were trying to prevent people from dying. So, Saddam Hussein, captured by the American soldiers when he went underground, and the courts of his own country, his own countrymen, put him on trial. They found him guilty of war crimes that he had committed against his own people, and they executed him. The United States remained in Iraq specifically to protect the Iraqi people while they established a new government for themselves. The communist government of North Korea, at the same time, alarmed world leaders when it admitted that it was breaking its pledge it made in 1994 to freeze on nuclear development. By 1993, they announced they had achieved nuclear missile capability, and they were ready to use them against the United States. On February 1st, let's go back to this one. So they shot him off, they landed in the ocean, it was over. Okay. On February 1st, 2003, NASA's Space Shuttle Columbia was re-entering the Earth's atmosphere when it burned up and broke up, and it killed its entire crew of 7 people. They discovered that there was a section of the space shuttle where the heat-resistant tile had actually fallen off, and so it was destroyed as it came in through the atmosphere. And this pretty much stopped the space program for a while because people were just like, this is like 2 space shuttles that have exploded, and we're not really sure if we should be putting a lot of money and putting a lot of people's lives on the line. And then November of 2003, pro-life groups rejoiced, yay, because Bush signed the Partial Birth Abortion Ban Act of 2003. Partial birth abortion is exactly what it sounds like. It is horrific, and it was legal. So the President of the United States said, no, I'm gonna sign this act that makes it illegal. So in a partial birth abortion, the doctor turns the child around while in the womb, and this can be done up to the day of birth. So it can be done through all 9 months, but they will turn the baby around and they'll deliver it forcibly, like with forceps, feet first. until all of the baby is hanging out of the mom with the exception of the head. And then before the head is delivered, they will snip the central nervous system, the spinal cord, and then using forceps crush the head and pull it out. That's a partial birth abortion. Basically, they murder the baby as it's being born. So people were pretty thankful that ban was passed. I believe it is back now. It has been overthrown by Obama. During August and September 2004, Florida and the Gulf Coast suffered 4 hurricanes. It was the first time in 118 years that 4 hurricanes hit the same state in a single season. And then in December 2004, there was a powerful earthquake in the Indian Ocean, and that set treacherous tsunamis in all directions. The waves killed almost 300,000 people in the countries of Sri Lanka, India, Thailand, and East Africa. That's a real photograph, by the way. Millions of people were left without homes, food, or drinkable water. Bush pledged 250,000, it should be 250, probably billion, in humanitarian relief, and many compassionate Americans donated millions of dollars to charities working in the area. The conflict in Iraq became a key issue in the election of 2004. Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts said, "I didn't vote for the war," and everybody's like, pretty sure you did, but whatever. So he became the main Democratic candidate for president running against Bush. He is not going to be well liked for a couple of reasons. First of all, when he fought in Vietnam, he was also part of the group that went to Laos and Cambodia. And when he came home, he said that he was on a mission from the president. It was supposed to be a top secret mission, and he believed that the president was acting illegally. So a lot of Vietnam vets who knew what the president was doing, he was trying to prevent loss of life, they didn't like him for saying that. He actually, that was back in the 60s. And then he also claimed in the 60s that when he came home, he took all of his medals and basically threw them over the White House fence. And when he was running for president, I mean, he had said this multiple times. Then when he ran for president, he said, "Oh, those weren't my medals. Those were, a friend's. I did that for a friend." Everybody's like, okay. So people who were in the military didn't like him for those reasons. But then he was also a little out of touch with the American people because he was married to a woman who was incredibly wealthy. And she was the heiress to the Heinz fortune. Heinz ketchup? Yeah, she was the heiress to that. And it came about one day. He was asked in one interview, how many houses do you actually own? He goes, I don't know. You'd have to ask my wife. People are like, oh, gosh. Okay, so okay. Then he chose for his running mate a man named John Edwards, and it was discovered that he had a really good background, and he was a doctor. His wife had cancer, but he's thinking, he's going to get the sympathy vote. And then it was discovered he was cheating on his wife while she was going through chemotherapy, and that was pretty much it for that campaign. So the media followed both campaigns closely, and they projected a victory for Kerry because they don't care about the guy's personal life. I mean, a guy can... his personal life doesn't have anything to do with how he runs the country, right? That's what we learned from Clinton. The president, however, received the majority of the popular vote, as well as the electoral vote. There were no disputes, no recounts. Then Hurricane Katrina hit the shores of Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana in 2005. The citizens of the area were told by the federal government, get out. Now, the federal government, the way it works is it will do a generalized release, but it also goes to the governor of a state and says, you need to get your people evacuated immediately. There is a big storm a-coming. And then the governor is supposed to talk to the different mayors of the different cities and say, you need to get your people out. There's a big storm a-coming. Well, the mayor of New Orleans said, we've gone through hurricanes before. We're not going to get people all in a panic. Come on. And so he didn't give that information to his people until it was too late. The people who were listening to the National Weather Service and being told to evacuate immediately, they packed up their cars and they got out. Some people said, no, we're going to stay behind. We've always stayed behind. And so they ended up having to be rescued. Other people said, we have nowhere to go. We don't have a decent vehicle to escape in. At that point, the US government was saying to the mayors and to the governors, you guys have school buses, you guys have other ways to evacuate your people, get people on buses and go. And some of them didn't do it. So a lot of people went to shelters that were, in the areas, and they tried to hang out there, but a lot of the shelters went underwater too. These floodwaters got so high, you're just seeing the rooftops here. You can see the floodwaters are all the way to the tops of trees and tops of houses. This is a big honking hurricane. You look how big this thing is. It covers all of Florida and has plenty of room left over. In New Orleans, most of the land is below sea level. They have built what are called dams or dikes. In other parts of the world, in New Orleans in the South, that's called a levee. It's basically a dike that holds the water back. They build it in below sea level. They build it up, and then they pump the water over that dike or levee, and that levee holds the water back from the area that is now being used as like either farmland or place to live or whatever. Okay, now the levees along Lake Pontchartrain began to break, began to give way because they hadn't been maintained. Who was in charge of taking care of the levees in Pontchartrain? The people of Louisiana. Their state government was responsible for that. Now, could they have gotten federal government for it as well? Very likely. But the truth is, nobody took care of them. And as a result, they gave way and they flooded the city on top of the rain and everything else that was coming in. They flooded the city with 20 feet of water in some places. Now, some people went absolutely stupidly crazy and they said, you know what happened? The United States government actually bombed the levees and they forced the people out. No, they didn't do that. Don't be stupid. The levees were poorly maintained and gave way. Nobody's going to be bombing the levees. Don't be stupid. Many people had evacuated. Thousands remained in the city and they were trapped by floodwaters and had to be rescued. Many of those who remained in the city became very angry and vocal against the government because it did not rescue them immediately. It did not provide immediate emergency assistance. But guess what? That's not the government's job. That's your job. I know that's hard for people to understand, but it is true. You are told in a variety of ways that you should have 3 days worth of food and water on hand in case of an emergency. It could be a forest fire. It could be a flood. The truth is the U.S. government cannot be there immediately. Sometimes there's a big storm going on. So people were told you should have had at least 3 days worth of food and water. And then when all of this went down, the U.S. government actually upped that to, you should think about having maybe a week's worth of food and water available. And then, of course, there was a lot of people who stayed behind willingly who were complaining that things didn't work out the way they thought it should. The death toll from Katrina was horrendous. More than 1,300 people, hundreds more missing, property damages in excess of $100 billion. The thing about New Orleans, because it is below sea level, a lot of their cemeteries were actually above ground and they just got destroyed. And there were ancient dead bodies floating around in the floodwaters along with people who actually died new in the flood. Unfortunately, some who call themselves community leaders who are really there to divide, they're the ones that accuse the government of destroying the levees on purpose. And they said the reason was an effort to destroy minority groups in the South. No. If you want to be cold about it, just absolutely cold about it, I'm going to say this. If you really believe that the government's doing this on purpose to get rid of minorities, you realize that they damaged over $1 billion of their own property to do so. Do you really think they would think that's worth it? If you're saying they could do one thing, how could they do the other? So yeah, these leaders have a history of destabilizing communities in order to increase their own power because they want to be in charge. And the best way they can be in charge is to scare people. Another challenge facing the Bush administration involved the appointment of new justices to the Supreme Court. John G. Roberts, nominated to take the place of Sandra Day O'Connor, but became Chief Justice when William Rehnquist passed away. Samuel Alito was nominated to take O'Connor's place. He was the focus of a fierce battle between liberals and conservatives. Senators John Kerry and Ted Kennedy staged a filibuster to postpone his confirmation, but he was confirmed in late January. Yeah, they didn't like him because they didn't think he was of good moral fiber. John Kerry and Ted Kennedy thinking somebody's not of good moral fiber? Yeah, I don't think so. Now, although Bush remained committed to helping Iraq build a democratic republic, the acts of insurgents caused many Americans to criticize the administration for its management in the conflict. Insurgents are people who don't live in the country, who come into the country specifically to destroy the country from within so they can take power for themselves. That's what an insurgent does. Now, as Bush is dealing with this issue, he's also dealing with the aftermath of Katrina when he has people making statements like, oh, you just decided to bomb the levees. On top of that, he made a huge mistake by putting a guy in charge of FEMA, the Federal Emergency something administration. Rats, I can't remember what the M stands for. He put a guy who really didn't have any kind of experience in that position, and that guy blew it. I mean, big time blew it. He had trailers set up for evacuees from Katrina, but he didn't have them actually hooked up to anything. So people were without sewage, water, or electricity while they're waiting for the floodwaters to subside so they can actually rebuild their homes. So he was dealing with that on the home front. He was dealing with this on an international level. In January of 2005, however, the Iraqis were able to hold their first election in 50 years. They were able to choose their own leader. And that purple ink on their finger was a way to stop people who were not Iraqi from voting falsely. It was to show that somebody had voted, they voted one time, and that was to prevent voter fraud. Many conservative groups began to question Bush's leadership in the area of border security because we have a huge southern border with hundreds and hundreds of miles that are not secure. And there was a problem going on in the United States with drugs coming in through what are called drug corridors on the southern border of the United States and coming into the country. There were some positive aspects to Bush's presidency. Thank goodness. He restored the might of the military. He strengthened some aspects of homeland defense, and he gave American families generous tax cuts. But after his second term in office, he has to step down, and the next person's going to be voted in. Throughout most of Bush's time in office, the Republican Party was in charge of Congress. However, after his reelection, his popularity declined, and that gave Democrats the opportunity to criticize many of his policies very openly on the floor of Congress and have it reported in the news. In the 2006 midterm congressional elections, the Democrats secured a majority of both houses of Congress. So, Republican president and a Democratic Congress. Not a whole lot going to get done now. Nancy Pelosi became the very first woman Speaker of the House. So just to give you clarity, she was already in the House. She was already serving in the House of Representatives. But 2006 is when she became the first Speaker of the House. She is still the Speaker of the House, and it is 2020. So she's been in that position for a very long time. She's actually been in politics for well over 30 years. I think it's closer to 40 now. Both Congress and the Supreme Court challenged the president on the status of prisoners of war being held in the American military base in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. This is called Camp X-Ray. Congress is saying, is this legal according to the Constitution? According to the Constitution, you have the right to a fair trial, fair and speedy trial. However, there is a separate set of standards for military tribunals. Military takes care of its own court system and trial. And a person who is captured as a prisoner of war can be held until their trial without being actually arrested going through that process. So the Congress is saying we need to move all of these prisoners of war into the United States mainland so that they can be under constitutional law so that we can just go ahead and prosecute them. But Bush is saying, no, we don't want to do that because there's a lot that needs to be investigated for some of these men. We are finding out information about them all the time. We need to keep them where we are keeping them. And that became a big issue in American government about the legality of Camp X-Ray in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. In 2008, Hillary Clinton, the former First Lady and Senator from New York, became the first woman ever to be a leading contender in one of the major parties for president. She was trying to get the Democratic vote to be on the Democratic ticket, because before you can say I'm, running on the Democratic ticket, you have to actually be chosen by the Democratic Party to be the candidate. And she was running against other people to become the Democratic candidate. And it narrowed it down to her and one other guy. And we will talk about that when we pick up after a few-minute break.